Time for the King of Fear, or one of them. Sorry, Sinestro. Scarecrow is probably one of my favorite Batman villains, if not my favorite. Although I also really like Mr. Freeze and Ivy. Unfortunately, Scarecrow's only ever appeared 3 times in live action. However, I think that is enough for me to rank them, based on my own personal opinions, which you of course do not need to agree with. We actually have an entire playlist about me ranking live action Batman villains. Links down below, we've done quite a bit of these. But without further ado, let's get into it. Last place is Titans, played by Vincent Karthesier, who isn't just my least favorite live-action Scarecrow, but just my least favorite Scarecrow in general. I did think that the idea of him being a consultant for the GCPD was kinda interesting. But then they revealed that he was actually the main villain. And while Red Hood being a Scarecrow goon isn't something that is necessarily new, it's done here in a way that kinda eclipses the character of Red Hood entirely. It takes that storyline and just simply gives it to Scarecrow, while Red Hood isn't really necessary for the actual story itself anymore. This Scarecrow also becomes nails on a chalkboard when it comes down to his fear obsession, as is depicted more as a torture kink than an actual obsession with fear. An odd route for the character. It also turns him into a bit of a questionable foe for Batman, or in this case, the Titans. And by questionable, I mean, why turn him into something that's more of a old perv? Which isn't helped by his scenes with Red Hood, who I know is intending to kind of be a bit of a father and son dynamic. It doesn't come across that way, instead Scarecrow comes across even creepier. The character is also way too giddy for what's meant to be a more stoic villain. He's also unnecessary for this plot, like, at all. This is a Titans show, not a Batman show. Why is he the main villain of an entire season? I think being a guest star like a consultant for the GCPD is fine for a Titans show. But for being the main villain and being the main villain of a pretty big arc from the comics is a bit of an odd choice. Now, while I do think that Titans is often overhated, I do think that season 3 is the worst season by far. And no, I'm not cutting out that mistake of me twisting my tongue, because I don't want to. It's funnier this way. Scarecrow makes me twist my tongue, for at least this iteration of Scarecrow. Now, like said, I think that season 3 of Titans is the worst, just the worst season of the entire series. And a big reason why is because of Scarecrow. In fact, if the character was replaced with, I don't know, Ra's al Ghul or Brother Blood or even Talia al Ghul, I think it would work better, because even though I'm not a big fan of Red Hood taking a backseat to his own storyline, Scarecrow also doesn't really make sense to be the villain behind it, because he's not really known for resurrecting people. I'm sorry if I'm trashing on this version of Scarecrow really badly, but you see, I love Scarecrow from the comics and other media, so this version really just frustrated me, which isn't anything against Vincent Karthesier, however you pronounce his name, because I do think he's trying his best in the role. It's just the role itself is just god-awful. In my opinion, it's god-awful. You can like it, by the way. Not trying to say you can't like it, I'm just saying I don't, it is my own ranking. And to me, god-awful Scarecrow. Light years better than number 2 is Gotham, where the character was played by Charlie Tannen and David Thompson. Jonathan Crane here is very different, being far younger and no longer a professor. However, while those do sound like problems, oddly, it still works. His obsession with fear comes from his torture and abuse from his father, who had drugged him with fear toxin, which is already a better explanation than Titan's Scarecrow. It's a very different take on the character, but it does still feel like the inspiration from the character from the comics. It's Scarecrow in spirit, even if not in origin. Okay, somewhat not in origin, because the abusive father thing is still from the comics. We see a different idea, that being the idea of embracing the fear. That Scarecrow himself is afraid of scarecrows. Something that I actually really like, because sometimes in the comics, while it has been done, it's never necessarily explained what it is that Jonathan Crane himself is afraid of. Therefore, the idea that it's himself, technically, is actually in a weird way poetic. Now, of course, it's not for everybody because it is very, very different from the source material. But at the same time, I still think he feels like Scarecrow, with the new twist actually being pretty decent. I wouldn't necessarily say I would like this being done in the comics with the character, that is, him being younger, not a professor. But for this show, I think it was done very well. I do think that the character, over time, became more overshadowed by other villains, since there were so many running around at one time, even all together. But even then, I do think that Scarecrow managed to shine from them. At least stand out in a certain way, especially because of the character's overall look. You always look directly at him whenever he's on screen. Although a small problem I do have with the character, and that with Firefly as well, who's also on the villain team, is that the show seemingly forgets how old they are. Because Scarecrow is said to be the same age as Bruce Wayne. Yet, everybody, and I mean everybody, acts as if he's an adult, and they don't try to reform him in any manner. I mean, of course, it's not going to work, but at the same time, I feel like Gordon, or at least somebody, would attempt to talk some sense into the kid, since he only became like this after the trauma he endured. But instead, they're openly shooting guns and giving all they got at this teenage Scarecrow, which is a little humorous to me. But even then, I still really enjoy it, because I think that the Scarecrow simply just is Scarecrow from the comics with a new twist. And number one is my all-time favorite version of Scarecrow, aside from maybe the 90s series, which is of course a Nolanverse, where the character is played by Cillian Murphy. This Crane has a very active role in this world, both as Scarecrow and Jonathan Crane, with a bit of a duality there with the two characters, who even though are the same person, still come across as distinct enough to be different people. As Crane is more stoic, more professional, while Scarecrow is more lunacy, the incarnate of fear. Yet regardless which one you're dealing with, they're both terrifying. The duality itself, I think, is a good contrast for Batman's duality, especially since both involve fear, although very, very different outcomes. I do think that his costume is a little bit lacking, however for this universe, I think it works. And because Cillian Murphy is just great in this role, I don't care if the costume is not the best. Even after Batman Begins, he still packs a punch in other films, even if his role is smaller. The character's inclusion of which is actually really welcomed, since previous Batman films had a very odd choice of always killing off the Batman villains, or those who didn't die never came back. That of course being the exception, Harvey Dent. So for Scarecrow to be a reoccurring foe in this universe, I think is a welcomed concept, because Batman villains are always causing problems for him in the comics, and they are reoccurring. So I really do like that they did that with Scarecrow here. A villain that always comes back. Something that is usually said about, well, all Batman villains. Well, okay, most Batman villains. And that's my ranking, which is ironically bookended by my least favorite Scarecrow ever, and it's my favorite Scarecrow ever. Not in live action, just in general. Also, me liking this Nolanverse version of Scarecrow might surprise some people, because I have said before that the Nolanverse for me is, well, pretty good. There are things I really dislike. But Scarecrow isn't one of those things. In fact, I think he was one of the best parts of the Nolanverse. If not the best. Okay, not the best. Second best after Heath Ledger's Joker. But anyways, that's it. Like always, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!